You have more access to help than any generation before you. More therapy content, more mental health awareness, more people finally talking about feelings openly. And somehow, you feel worse. That's not supposed to make sense, but it does once you understand what's actually happening. Because Gen Z isn't struggling despite having more resources. In some strange way, you're struggling because of how those resources arrived, stacked on top of a world that changed faster than anyone's mind could adjust to it. This matters right now because the numbers aren't subtle anymore. Anxiety and depression rates among young people have climbed sharply over the last decade, and it didn't happen randomly. It happened alongside a specific set of shifts: constant comparison, unstable footing in work and money, a blurred line between rest and performance, and a strange, quiet loneliness that exists even when you're surrounded by people online, all day, every day. So let's actually understand the mechanism, not the surface explanation, the real one. Start with comparison, because this is where it begins for almost everyone. Every generation compared themselves to others. That part isn't new. What's new is the volume and speed. You used to compare yourself to a handful of people in your actual life. Now you compare yourself to a curated highlight reel from thousands of strangers, updated constantly, all showing their best 5 seconds of existence. Your brain doesn't fully register the difference between this is a highlight and this is normal life. It just registers everyone is doing better than me. Do that enough times a day, every day, for years, and it stops being a passing thought. It becomes a quiet background belief about your own worth. Now, add something most people don't talk about: instability. You grew up watching adults lose jobs overnight, watching a pandemic shut down the world with no warning, watching housing prices and living costs rise faster than wages ever could. You were told to work hard and things would work out, the same promise every generation was told, except the math genuinely stopped working the way it used to. So you're building a life on ground that keeps shifting, and here's the psychological cost of that. When your environment feels unpredictable, your brain doesn't relax into long-term planning. It shifts into a low-grade survival mode. Not dramatic panic, just constant, quiet vigilance. And vigilance held long enough turns into exhaustion. Exhaustion held long enough turns into something heavier.
Here's where it gets uncomfortable, because most people assume depression comes from one big traumatic event. Sometimes it does. But for a lot of Gen Z, it's not one event, it's accumulation. Small, constant pressures that never fully let up, so your nervous system never gets the signal that it's safe to fully exhale. Now, let's talk about rest, because this is the part that quietly makes everything worse. You think you're resting when you scroll. You lie down, phone in hand, telling yourself this is downtime. But scrolling isn't rest. It's just low-effort stimulation. Your body is still, but your brain is still processing, comparing, reacting. You get up from an hour of scrolling feeling more drained than before you started, and you don't understand why, because it looked like doing nothing. This is the trap. The activity that looks like rest is often quietly feeding the exhaustion it's supposed to relieve. And here's where the contrast really shows up between how you think you're taking care of yourself and how you actually are. You tell yourself you're fine because you're self-aware. You know the terminology. You can name your anxiety, label your triggers, explain your attachment style in a 2-minute video. That must count for something, right? But knowing the language of mental health and actually regulating your mental health are two completely different skills. You can understand exactly why you feel a certain way and still not know how to change it. Awareness without action just becomes a more articulate way of staying stuck. This is the quiet irony of your generation. You're the most emotionally literate generation in history, and also one of the most emotionally exhausted. Because understanding a problem intellectually doesn't automatically give your nervous system relief. Sometimes it just gives you a very precise vocabulary for describing your own suffering. Now, here's something almost nobody says out loud. A lot of Gen Z depression isn't loud. It doesn't look like crying in your room or staying in bed for days, though sometimes it does. More often, it looks like function. You go to class, you go to work, you post normally, you reply to texts eventually. From the outside, everything looks fine. Inside, there's just a flatness, a quiet sense that nothing feels particularly meaningful, but nothing is dramatically wrong either. It's easy to dismiss that feeling because it doesn't match what depression is supposed to look like. So you push through it. Tell yourself you're just tired, just busy, just going through a phase.
And the phase keeps not ending. Here's the deeper mechanism underneath all of this. Depression often isn't really about sadness. It's about disconnection. Disconnection from meaning, from rest, from other people, from a version of your future that actually feels believable. And Gen Z is dealing with disconnection on almost every one of those fronts simultaneously. Meaning feels unstable because the traditional markers of adulthood, stable job, owning a home, a clear timeline, don't arrive the way they used to. Rest feels unstable because your nervous system rarely fully powers down. Connection feels unstable because most of your relationships live through a screen where presence is easy to fake and easy to miss. And belief in the future feels unstable because you're watching systems around you struggle in ways that are hard to ignore. Take away enough stability on enough fronts for long enough, and depression isn't some rare malfunction. It's almost the predictable outcome. Now zoom out, because this doesn't just live in your own head. It shapes how an entire generation moves through the world. It shows up in how you approach relationships, where vulnerability feels risky, so a lot of people default to irony, distance, or joking about their pain instead of naming it directly. It shows up in how you approach work, where burnout arrives earlier than it used to, because the emotional reserves needed to absorb stress are already running low before the workday even starts. It shows up in how you see your own future, where ambition quietly shrinks, not from laziness, but from self-protection. It's hard to plan 10 years ahead when the last 5 didn't go the way anyone expected. None of this means something is broken about you individually. It means an entire generation is carrying a weight that's mostly invisible because it doesn't look like one identifiable crisis. It looks like 1,000 small erosions happening at once. So here's where this leaves you. The most dangerous part of this pattern isn't the low moments themselves, it's how normal they start to feel. When exhaustion becomes your baseline, you stop noticing it as a problem. You just call it Tuesday. Which raises the real question, not why are you tired, but what would it actually take for you, for this generation, to feel safe enough to stop just surviving the day and start believing in one that's actually coming?